Have you ever noticed how some people don't walk away from a relationship because they are truly ready for it to end? They leave with the expectation that you will follow them. They anticipate tears, urgency, and emotional chasing. They expect silence to trigger panic, messages, and attempts to pull them back. But when none of that happens, they are often left disoriented. What they did not prepare for is the possibility that you might not react at all, and instead allow distance to remain. That absence of reaction changes everything because it breaks the outcome they had already rehearsed in their mind and replaces it with something they did not anticipate: indifference and acceptance. This shift alone can completely destabilize their expectations of control. Many people assume that when a narcissistic person ends a relationship, it means they are completely finished with it emotionally. In reality, that is not always the case. Sometimes leaving is not about closure, but about testing influence and power. In relationships shaped by emotional imbalance, one person may gradually come to rely on control, attention, and validation rather than mutual connection. In such dynamics, withdrawing affection, going silent, or threatening to leave can become tools used during conflict. These actions are not always a sign of finality, but rather experiments to see how the other person will respond. The underlying expectation is that distance will provoke urgency, emotional distress, and immediate attempts to repair the bond. This pattern is often repeated until it becomes the default relational strategy. For the person engaging in this pattern, the anticipated response becomes almost as important as the conflict itself. They come to expect that the other person will react quickly, seek reassurance, and take responsibility in order to restore emotional balance. Each time this happens, it reinforces the belief that withdrawing or creating tension is an effective way to regain attention and importance. Over time, even apologizing, over-explaining, or sending repeated messages in distress becomes part of a cycle that strengthens this dynamic. The pursuit itself begins to matter more than resolving the original issue because it consistently confirms their perceived emotional significance and control within the relationship. This reinforces a loop where emotional disruption becomes a tool for maintaining connection. Beneath this outward behavior often lies a fragile sense of self-worth that depends heavily on external validation. When someone pursues them after withdrawal, it temporarily soothes insecurity and reinforces the identity they are trying to uphold. Over time, this can create an expectation that others will always respond in this way, leading to a sense of entitlement to emotional pursuit. Silence, however, disrupts this internal script. When the expected reaction does not arrive, it creates discomfort because the familiar source of reassurance is missing. Without it, the carefully maintained sense of control and significance begins to feel unstable, exposing the dependency that was previously hidden behind confident behavior. In that moment, the illusion of emotional leverage begins to weaken significantly. When this cycle is interrupted, the entire pattern begins to collapse. The person who once expected pursuit is met with silence instead. Messages go unanswered, emotional signals are not returned, and the usual back-and-forth dynamic disappears. This absence of response removes the feedback loop they relied on to feel in control. What was once predictable becomes uncertain, and that uncertainty can be deeply unsettling. It reveals that emotional influence is not automatic and depends on the willingness of the other person to engage. Without that engagement, the sense of control they believed they had over the relationship begins to dissolve, exposing the underlying truth that the connection was heavily dependent on reaction rather than genuine emotional stability. This is where real emotional boundaries start to become visible. Although they may talk about love, commitment, and emotional connection, their behavior often points to a stronger drive to influence the direction of the relationship and shape how others respond to them. This control can show up in quiet, indirect ways, such as choosing when communication is allowed, setting emotional expectations that apply unevenly, or creating situations where the other person feels they must earn approval. In balanced relationships, both people share equal emotional space, equal input, and freedom to express themselves. In this kind of dynamic, however, the focus can slowly shift so that one person becomes the center of attention, reassurance, and accommodation, while the other gradually adapts to maintain harmony. The more this pattern continues, the more the imbalance feels normal, and the stronger the expectation becomes that the other person will consistently pursue and adjust. Whenever the other person begins to act independently, it can feel threatening to this established pattern of control. Simple acts like no longer seeking permission, reducing emotional explanations, or refusing to react to manipulative behavior can shift the balance significantly. The discomfort is not usually about the specific issue being discussed, but about the loss of predictability and influence. Once someone stops responding in the expected way, the framework they relied upon starts to weaken. What is being lost is not just agreement, but the ability to anticipate outcomes. This unpredictability challenges the sense of authority that had been built over time. At the same time, the withdrawal of emotional engagement removes a key distraction, leaving less room to avoid internal reflection because the constant cycle of reaction and pursuit is no longer available within the dynamic itself unfolding now. Once the usual emotional reactions are no longer available, the entire system begins to change. The absence of responses removes the validation that previously reinforced their sense of importance. Without someone reacting, explaining, or trying to fix things, the familiar cycle collapses. At the same time, it also takes away a convenient place to redirect blame or frustration, making it harder to maintain old patterns of avoidance. In many cases, emotional distance is used to create uncertainty, because uncertainty naturally draws attention. When communication becomes inconsistent or unclear, the other person often starts to focus more on understanding what is happening. This can lead them to overthink, analyze interactions, and invest more emotional energy into restoring clarity. In doing so, attention shifts back toward the person who initiated the distance, reinforcing the very dynamic that was intended within the cycle. When someone becomes increasingly anxious in a relationship, they often feel compelled to reach out more frequently, seek reassurance, or agree to things they would normally resist. This emotional tension creates a dynamic where attention is given without direct requests. Instead of explicitly demanding reassurance, the uncertainty itself pushes the other person into offering it voluntarily. During this waiting period, silence becomes a form of testing ground. By pulling back and observing, the person creating distance watches closely for signs of concern, pursuit, or emotional urgency. Every message, apology, or attempt to reconnect is then interpreted as confirmation of their continued influence. The purpose is not genuine resolution of conflict, but the measurement of emotional dependence. The longer the other person remains focused on restoring connection, the more it reinforces the perception of control and importance within the relationship dynamic. In many unhealthy relational patterns, one person gradually becomes accustomed to sacrificing their own needs, boundaries, and emotional comfort simply to preserve the connection. They may tolerate disrespect, excuse harmful behavior, ignore repeated disappointments, or accept unequal treatment due to fear of abandonment or conflict. Over time, this repeated compromise begins to normalize imbalance, and the other person starts expecting constant accommodation as the default state. When self-respect begins to develop, however, this pattern starts to shift. The individual becomes more aware that their emotions, needs, and boundaries hold equal value. They become less willing to pursue someone who withdraws affection, less likely to justify mistreatment, and less inclined to take responsibility for issues they did not create. Decisions begin to come from inner worth rather than fear, quietly transforming the structure of the relationship. As this shift continues, the strategies that once maintained control begin to lose their effectiveness. Behaviors such as silent treatment, guilt-based pressure, or emotional withdrawal no longer create the same predictable reactions. Instead of responding out of fear or urgency, the individual begins evaluating situations through the lens of self-respect and emotional well-being. This naturally reduces dependency, meaning the relationship is no longer the central source of identity, validation, or security. With that emotional reliance reduced, the balance of power shifts without force or confrontation. The person becomes more focused on protecting inner stability and personal boundaries than preserving the connection at any cost. As emotional independence grows, the expected reactions that once reinforced control gradually disappear, fundamentally changing how the dynamic operates. A narcissistic injury occurs when a carefully constructed self-image of importance, admiration, or control is disrupted. When external validation is present, this self-perception feels stable and reinforced. However, when that validation is withdrawn or no longer provided, discomfort emerges because self-worth is often tied to external response. In relationships, this injury can occur when someone refuses to engage in expected patterns, such as chasing after distance or reacting with emotional urgency. When those anticipated reactions do not appear, the individual is faced with a reality that contradicts their expectations of influence. The issue is not simply the loss of connection, but the loss of emotional confirmation that supports identity. This disruption creates instability because it exposes a gap between internal self-perception and external response, challenging deeply held assumptions about control and significance. When this sense of self becomes threatened, reactions can vary significantly depending on the individual. Some may respond with anger, criticism, or attempts to assign blame, while others may shift suddenly into heightened attention in an effort to regain lost emotional connection. Although these behaviors appear different on the surface, they often stem from the same internal discomfort and need for reassurance. The underlying goal is to restore a sense of control, importance, or validation that feels disrupted. Whether through withdrawal, confrontation, or sudden engagement, the response is typically centered on repairing a destabilized self-image. These reactions are less about the other person involved and more about reestablishing internal emotional balance. When expected responses are no longer available, efforts to recreate them often become more visible and intensified. Indifference tends to be more psychologically powerful than revenge because revenge keeps emotional attachment active. When someone feels hurt, it is natural to imagine confrontation, exposure, or making the other person regret their actions. However, even these thoughts still keep attention tied to the source of pain. Time, energy, and emotional focus remain connected to that individual. Indifference functions differently. It is not suppression or denial, but a gradual withdrawal of emotional investment. The person no longer seeks validation, approval, or reaction from the other side. Their behavior and opinions lose influence over emotional state and self-worth. Instead of attempting to provoke a response, attention shifts toward healing and rebuilding life. Because no reaction is required or desired, indifference removes the emotional leverage that once sustained the connection and gives control back to personal emotional independence. The focus gradually moves away from trying to fix or change the narcissist and shifts toward developing inner strength and personal direction. This shift is often hard for them to understand because they are used to being the emotional center of someone's world, where their attention and reactions carry significant influence. When a person reaches the point where they no longer feel the need to explain themselves, seek closure, argue, or retaliate, the entire dynamic begins to change. The emotional grip that once held the pattern together slowly weakens. The narcissist loses access to the predictable responses, emotional reactions, and validation that used to keep the cycle active. And with that loss, their sense of control over the relationship starts to fade. When the narcissist expects you to beg for their return and you simply do not, something important shifts inside the dynamic. What begins is not just the end of a reactive cycle, but the start of emotional recovery and self-ownership. In that space, you start taking back your emotional life, where decisions are no longer driven by fear of abandonment, pressure for approval, or the hope of being validated by someone who once held influence over your feelings. Instead, your choices become rooted in clarity, self-respect, and the understanding that healthy relationships never require you to lose your dignity to maintain them. They may misinterpret your silence as anger, stubbornness, or manipulation. But your change was never about controlling their perception. It was about stepping out of a cycle that depended on your emotional exhaustion to continue. The most important lesson in all of this is not that the narcissist lost control over you, but that you realized you were never meant to base your life on seeking their permission, approval, or validation. Their interpretation of your silence may vary, as they might assume you are angry, playing games, or trying to punish them, but none of those assumptions reflect your reality. Your journey has always been about reclaiming emotional independence. Every moment you chose not to chase, not to explain yourself, and not to beg represented a quiet return to self-respect and inner clarity. Over time, you stopped measuring your worth through their reactions and started grounding it in your own understanding of what you deserve. True victory was never about winning them back. It was about finally choosing yourself. What you're really looking at here is the shift from external emotional dependence to internal emotional stability. In many unhealthy relational dynamics, a person becomes conditioned to measure their worth through the reactions of the other person. Attention feels like safety, silence feels like danger, and inconsistency creates a loop where the mind stays focused on fixing the connection instead of evaluating whether the connection is healthy in the first place. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional tunnel vision where the relationship becomes the main source of meaning, even when it repeatedly causes distress. When that pattern is interrupted, something important happens. At first, the absence of a response can feel confusing or even painful because the nervous system is used to predictable cycles of engagement. But gradually, the focus starts to shift. Instead of asking, "How do I get them back?" the mind begins to ask, "Why was I willing to lose myself for this in the first place?" That question marks the beginning of emotional detachment, not in a cold or indifferent sense, but in a clarifying sense where reality starts to come into view without the emotional distortion of fear or attachment. A key part of this shift is recognizing that control in such dynamics is often maintained through reaction. It is not always about what is said or done directly, but about how strongly someone responds. Intense emotional reactions, whether they are anxiety, pleading, anger, or over-explaining, can unintentionally reinforce the cycle because they keep the emotional focus locked on the other person. When those reactions start to fade, the dynamic loses its fuel. Silence, calmness, and non-reactivity are not strategies for winning, but natural signs that the emotional dependency is weakening. As this continues, the idea of closure also begins to change. Instead of waiting for explanations, accountability, or the other person's understanding, a person slowly realizes that closure is something they create internally. It comes from accepting that clarity does not always arrive through conversation. Sometimes it arrives through observation over time, where patterns speak more loudly than words ever did. This realization is often uncomfortable at first, but it is also freeing because it removes the need to depend on someone else's version of reality. Eventually, what replaces the old cycle is a more grounded sense of self. Choices are no longer driven by fear of loss or hope of validation, but by alignment with personal values and emotional well-being. The relationship stops being the center of identity and becomes just one part of a much larger life. At that point, the most significant transformation has already happened. The shift from trying to be chosen by someone else to consciously choosing yourself, not as a reaction, but as a stable way of living. One of the most overlooked parts of this whole dynamic is how long it can take for the nervous system to stop expecting the old pattern. Even when someone logically understands that the cycle is unhealthy, emotionally they may still feel pulled toward it. This is because repeated emotional highs and lows can create a strong attachment loop. The brain starts to associate inconsistency with importance and attention with relief. So even silence can feel loud, not because of what the other person is doing, but because the body has learned to stay alert for the next emotional shift. As this pattern weakens, there is often a strange in-between stage where a person is no longer fully chasing, but not yet fully detached either. In this stage, the urge to reach out can still appear, especially during moments of loneliness, doubt, or emotional vulnerability. What changes is not the absence of feeling, but the response to it. Instead of acting on impulse, there is a growing ability to pause and observe the feeling without immediately turning it into action. That pause is where real control begins to return. Another important shift happens in how memories are processed. In the early stages of detachment, the mind often selectively remembers emotional intensity, especially the moments of connection or hope, while minimizing the patterns of inconsistency or hurt. Over time, this begins to balance out. The full picture starts to form more clearly, not just the emotional peaks, but also the emotional costs. This clarity is not about demonizing the other person, but about seeing the relationship as it actually was, rather than how it was hoped to be. With that clarity, the idea of winning or losing becomes less relevant. What once felt like a battle for attention or validation starts to feel like a situation that no longer requires participation. Energy that was previously directed toward understanding, fixing, or waiting slowly gets redirected inward. Not in a forced way, but naturally, as emotional investment decreases. Life outside the relationship begins to feel more present again, and other parts of identity slowly return. Eventually, the emotional weight that once felt central starts to fade into the background. The connection may still be remembered, but it no longer defines direction or self-worth. What remains is a quieter but stronger foundation, where self-respect is not something actively fought for, but something that has become the default way of relating to oneself and others. As emotional distance grows, another subtle change begins to take place. The focus of attention shifts away from the other person's behavior and back toward personal patterns. Instead of constantly analyzing what they did, said, or didn't do, there is a growing awareness of how much internal energy was spent trying to manage uncertainty. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes the familiar external focus and replaces it with self-reflection. But this is also where deeper healing begins, because the attention that was once tied up in someone else starts returning to the self. At this stage, many people start noticing how often they ignored their own intuition in order to maintain connection. There is a gradual recognition of moments where discomfort was explained away, boundaries were softened, and emotional needs were postponed in the hope that things would improve. This realization is not about blame, but about awareness. It reveals how easy it is to become disconnected from oneself when validation is coming from an inconsistent source. And with that awareness comes a stronger commitment not to repeat the same pattern again. Over time, emotional triggers that once felt overwhelming begin to lose intensity. Situations that previously caused anxiety or urgency no longer carry the same weight. A delayed message, a lack of response, or emotional withdrawal no longer immediately leads to panic or overthinking. Instead, there is space to interpret these moments more calmly, without assuming responsibility for them. This emotional steadiness is not detachment from feeling, but regulation of feeling, where reactions no longer control behavior. As stability grows, the idea of closure becomes even less dependent on external input. There is less need for explanations, apologies, or final conversations, because understanding is already forming internally. The mind stops waiting for a perfect ending and begins accepting that some experiences are meant to be understood through distance rather than resolution. This acceptance reduces emotional friction and allows energy to move forward instead of staying stuck in cycles of replaying the past. Eventually, what replaces the old emotional pattern is a quieter confidence, not a sense of superiority or victory over someone else, but a grounded awareness that peace is no longer negotiable. Relationships are no longer measured by intensity or uncertainty, but by consistency, respect, and emotional safety. And in that shift, the most important change has already happened. The need to be chosen by someone unstable is replaced by the decision to choose what is stable, respectful, and aligned with personal well-being. As this process continues, one of the clearest signs of real change is how differently emotional discomfort is handled. Earlier in the cycle, discomfort often triggered immediate action. sending messages, seeking reassurance, over explaining, or trying to fix the situation quickly just to relieve anxiety. But with time, discomfort starts to lose its authority. It is still felt, but it is no longer automatically obeyed. Instead of reacting instantly, there is more space to sit with the feeling and recognize that not every emotional surge requires an external solution. This shift changes the entire structure of attachment. The relationship between emotion and action becomes less automatic and more intentional. A person begins to realize that urgency is not always truth. It is often just a learned response to inconsistency. That awareness slowly breaks the illusion that immediate action is necessary to restore safety. In reality, safety begins to come from within, not from the other person's response. This is a quiet but powerful transformation because it means emotional regulation is no longer outsourced. Another important development is the reduction of emotional interpretation. In earlier stages, every silence, delay, or change in tone might have been analyzed for hidden meaning. The mind tries to fill gaps with assumptions, often leaning toward fear-based conclusions. As emotional maturity grows, there is less need to decode every detail. Ambiguity becomes tolerable. Instead of assuming meaning, there is a growing acceptance that not everything requires interpretation and not everything is directed personally. With this acceptance, emotional energy begins to stabilize. The inner world becomes less reactive and more grounded. What once felt like emotional chaos starts to feel quieter, even when external circumstances remain the same. The difference is not in the situation itself, but in the internal relationship to it. That is where true independence begins to take shape, not in changing others, but in no longer being controlled by their inconsistency. Eventually, the focus shifts fully away from monitoring someone else's behavior and toward building a life that feels steady regardless of external responses. The question is no longer what do they feel or want, but what feels right, healthy, and aligned for me. That is the point where emotional freedom becomes real, not as an idea, but as a lived internal state where peace is no longer conditional on anyone else's presence or validation.